Good evening folks, it's James here. How you all doing? I hope you're keeping well. Going to do a response to a brilliant video that my friend Richard McCook has uploaded. He wants us to show and talk about 5 favourite record producers. So I thought this was a good idea. I must admit I did think of this idea a while ago. I told Richard that. It's one of those ideas I've been meaning to do a thing on record producers and I just haven't got my act together, and then Richard told me he was going to do it and I said, yeah, okay, fair enough. You've got to get in there in order to be the first to do it, and but I was quite happy that Richard had done it, and I was quite happy that he did 5 as well, because I was going to do 10, but there's always a temptation that you're going to cover too many people and leave not enough people, not enough records for the people to show, so that's quite nice. Favourite producers, I do have quite a few favourite producers and I'll whip through these, don't want to take too long over it. Okay, so I thought I'd show this rather than showing the absolutely obvious records that I could have shown. This is America, and this album is produced by George Martin, and possibly the most important pop-based record producer that ever lived. If he hadn't have signed the Beatles, then who knows what would have happened. He didn't just sign them, but he also worked with them, nurtured them, helped them to produce this amazing body of work, which was a platform for so many other artists. But that's not why I love George Martin. I love George Martin because of the sound he always gets, not just on the Beatles records, but other records that he produces. You can hear it on this record. It sounds like it's got that classic. If you listen to albums like Tug of War by Paul McCartney, the beautifully thick, mellifluous kind of backing vocals and just creamy, beautiful instrumentation. And he was great at just making everything sound amazing. I mean, the Beatles had other help in the studio, people like Jeff Emerick. The engineers were really important on the Beatles albums, but I think you can sort of hear when George Martin is absent. When you listen to the White Album, it's a great album, but it doesn't really have the classic Beatles sound to it. If you compare it to the stuff, if you compare it to Revolver, if you compare it to Hard Day's Night, there was something about George Martin's production which always made things sound very pleasant on the ear, very beautiful. He had a very sort of open sound, and his stuff slips down really easily. I think he just had a way. I mean, he was clearly incredibly accomplished as an arranger, and I think he was good with people as well. He was a very nurturing spirit. Obviously, that was his main contribution to the Beatles, really, was just allowing them to be who they wanted to be, not trying to force them to do anything that they didn't want to do. And he was incredibly open to their suggestions, and his work on Abbey Road, just kind of absolutely peerless pop symphonic majesty, really. And he was just such a great guy. I can't really express. One of the first videos I ever made on the vinyl community, if you go back and have a look, I think it was perhaps my 2nd or 3rd video. It was just when George Martin had passed away, and I sat in my kitchen here and went through my Beatles albums and talked about George Martin and of my love and respect for him. Definitely the 5th Beatle, no question about it. Okay, so jumping ahead now in time, and we're going to just quickly talk about Trevor Horn, who has been a massive part of my musical life for so many years. I discovered that I got into him when the video Kill the Radio Star came out, which was, I think it was at the back end of 1979. That record sounded like the future. There was nothing around like it at the time. He was so far ahead of the curve, and he had a kind of magical fairy dust quality to his work. It was futuristic, but it was also nostalgic, and the Buggles only did a couple of records, both superb. Then of course Trevor went on to produce a whole range of artists. This is one of the most amazing sounding records that was ever made. This is The Lexicon of Love by ABC, and Trevor Horn was one of the most instrumental people in the development of the Fairlight synthesizer and how it was going to be used in pop music in the 80s, and most of his stuff, if you look back at it now, it has a very prophetic kind of sound. He knew the way that the wind was blowing, but it was interesting because he was a bit old in the tooth, really, to be a pop star, really, in the late 1970s. I think he was already, I'm not sure if he was in his late 20s or early 30s, but he was no spring chicken, and he'd been in other bands before, and he had a sort of prog background. He'd been really into Yes. Like, he'd been a massive fan of the album Tales from Topographic Oceans. And he brought that sensibility into kind of early 80s pop music, and you can hear it on Frankie Goes to Hollywood, you can hear it on Lexicon of Love, even though he was working in that kind of short form format, which was obviously massive in the New Wave era. He was able to somehow crack open that formula and make everything really big and bold and adventurous, and a bit like George Martin again, almost symphonic. If you think of those Frankie records, you know, they're painted on a very, very wide canvas, and just that sense of overarching ambition in his work was just extraordinary, really. So, yeah, Trevor Horn, genius. Right, the next guy we're going to look at, and these are all men, I do apologise, but that's just the way that the cookie has crumbled on this occasion. But we have, this is the Pretenders' second album, and the guy I want to talk about is Chris Thomas, who, you know, what an amazing CV he had. He worked with the Beatles originally, and then he went on through the 1970s to work with so many people. He produced Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. He did the Pretenders. He did Wings. He did Back to the Egg by Wings, which is not one of their better albums, really. You know, one of the hardest things that you can do as a producer is to take a band like the Pretenders, who were very powerful instrumentally, and just capture what they did and turn it into a record. It's quite funny because people think of the Sex Pistols album as being this very raw, kind of raucous album, but it's one of the most produced records that you'll ever hear, really. You know, he took the live template of what the Sex Pistols did, which was extremely rough and ready and shambolic and ramshackle, and turned it into something which sounded like them, but it was also a state-of-the-art recording. So he just had a really great track record of producing great records. So, yeah, Chris Thomas, number 3. Next we have, okay, so this is a band that Richard does not like, and I assume he's not a big fan of this guy either, but this is Prefab Sprout and Steve McQueen. So the producer in question, of course, and the print is too small to show, is Thomas Dolby, who was a pop artist in his own right, and he produced his own records, and I love his solo albums, but I also totally love the work he did with Prefab Sprout. So he did this record, he did Jordan the Comeback, we did From Langley Park to Memphis. Thomas Dolby and Paddy McAloon were a great team, knew their way around all the different harmonic structures, so they were very, very, I think they were very close in the studio. And there's something about Thomas Dolby's production style which I find very reassuring. He has that, a bit like Trevor Horn, he has that kind of nostalgic feel to his music. It's sort of futuristic and state-of-the-art, but it also seems to harken back to past times. And this record has got some wonderful sort of autumnal textures on it. And I don't know what it was, some kind of little elusive ingredient, you know, some sort of magic fairy dust of some kind. It's hard to put your finger on it. I think it's to do with it. It is to do with knowing your way around a harmonic progression and knowing what chords are going to work with songs. You know, not going with the most obvious examples of chord progressions, and just being able to tease interesting tangents out of songs and just making them more exploratory and actually really, really evoking emotions. That was what Dolby was so great at doing in his productions. A lot of his early stuff was kind of synth-based, but you know, later on in his career he did a lot of stuff with kind of world music almost. He did, you know, funk and R&B. He worked with people like Eddie Van Halen, and he worked with George Clinton. He was just a real all-rounder, and I've just always loved his production style, really. So yeah, Thomas Dolby. Okay, so I think we're on number 5 now. I wanted to give a shout out to this guy. So this is the album Clear Spot by Captain Beefheart, and the producer in question is Ted Templeman. And I was going to pull out a Doobie Brothers record, and then I thought I'll pull this one out because it's pretty amazing what he did to Captain Beefheart. This was during a period when Captain Beefheart wanted to become a bit more chart friendly. I think he wanted to appeal more to the girls in the audience, really. And Ted Templeman, this American producer who had got this amazing track record of very, very beautiful sounding records, you know, kind of mainstream, but still, you know, not kind of pappy mainstream. He still had artistic credibility. and the list of artists he worked with is just extraordinary, and he always got the same kind of sound. As he got further into the 1970s, it sort of became more and more yacht rock, really. But his brief, or his remit, I think, was always just to make bands sound as great as they could possibly be. There was nothing lo-fi about his work at all. So on the records he produced, you always get this very, very clearly defined soundscape where the instruments are just very tightly in sync with each other. Just the arrangement, you know. If you compare this album to the albums before that Captain Beefheart did, on Spotlight Kid, you can hear him edging in that direction of being more commercial, but the sound is nothing like as rich or as colourful. I think often that is the mark of a good producer, if they're working with a good engineer as well, is that they're able to get the most out of the artist sonically, you know, just make them leap off the vinyl and just sound tremendous. And that's what Ted Templeman always did. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, Richard, for getting me to finally do this video, and I hope some other people will jump on it. Take care, folks. See you soon. Bye-bye.